mirrors of Red Oak Hollow. In the hills of eastern Kentucky, nestled in the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains, there lies a town so old that its history has been buried beneath the dirt and dust of time. The name of the town is Red Oak Hollow, and most folks in the area say it's a place where the past and future blur like smoke in a fire. Few outsiders venture there, but those who do, well, they never leave the same. Red Oak Hollow was founded over 200 years ago, a small settlement of settlers trying to carve out a life from the land, scratching for a living in the rocky, unforgiving hills. But as the years passed, strange things started to happen. Folk began noticing oddities, things that didn't sit right. It wasn't the land was rich and fertile, but it was the mirrors. The first sign came when a traveling preacher stopped in town one winter evening. He was a young man, not more than 30, and was searching for a place to lay his head for the night. He came upon an old woman sitting on the porch of the general store, staring at the ground as if waiting for something. He greeted her kindly as preachers do, and she looked up, eyes gleaming like embers in the dimming twilight. "Are you lost, stranger?" she asked in a voice as cracked as dry leaves. "No, ma'am. I'm just passing through," he said, noticing her long, thin fingers gripping the arm of her chair. "But I wonder, can you tell me about this town?" The woman's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she spoke again. "This town, young man, is a place where time doesn't run quite right. You see, the mirrors here don't just show your reflection, they show your future. And what they show isn't always something you want to see." The preacher, skeptical, chuckled to himself. He had heard such tales before. Old wives' fables meant to spook children. But the old woman's eyes, deep as the hollows in the hills, made him uneasy. He decided to stay for the night. That night, the preacher couldn't sleep. His room at the inn felt cold, like something had entered with him. As he lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, a knock came at his door. He sat up, startled, and went to answer. Standing there in the doorway was a young man, pale as a ghost, eyes wide and frantic. "You have to help me," the young man begged. "I saw it. I saw my death in the mirror." The preacher, taken aback, looked at the man's trembling hands and his wide, fearful eyes. "What do you mean? What mirror?" "The one in my house," the man said, shaking. "My mother warned me not to look into it, but I did. And I saw myself, dead, lying in a field of red. I tried to turn away, but the image wouldn't leave. I saw it so clearly, and I know it's going to happen." The preacher didn't know what to say. He took the young man's hand and led him to a chair, trying to calm him. "There are no such things as cursed mirrors, son. You've had a bad dream, that's all. Just a dream." But the young man would not be comforted. No, I saw it. I swear I saw it. Please, you have to help me. I don't want to die." By the time the preacher managed to calm the young man enough to sleep, the sun was beginning to rise. The preacher, now thoroughly unsettled, tried to sleep himself, but he could not shake the strange feeling that hung over the town. As the hours passed, his curiosity grew. He had heard whispers among the townsfolk of these mysterious mirrors, and he was determined to see one for himself. After breakfast, he made his way to the house of an elderly man named Ezra, who was known to own the oldest and most respected mirror in the town. The preacher knocked, and the door creaked open, revealing a man with white hair and sunken eyes. "Can I help you, preacher?" Ezra asked, his voice rasping. "I've heard talk of your mirror," the preacher said, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. "I would like to see it." Ezra studied him for a long moment, and then, without a word, turned and led him down a dark hallway to a small room at the back of the house. The room was dim, the only light coming from a single window covered by thick curtains. But the mirror, the mirror, it hung on the wall like a relic from another time. The frame was old, wooden and weathered, with intricate carvings of leaves and vines. But it wasn't the frame that caught the preacher's attention. It was the mirror itself. The glass was deep, dark, and as smooth as glass can be. It didn't reflect the room at first, but as the preacher stood before it, his own image slowly appeared, distorted at first and then sharp. He frowned, stepping closer. The mirror didn't show the room behind him or the shadows of dust in the corners. No, it showed something different. It showed a scene, one he knew was not his own. It was a street, long and winding, the dust of summer rising in the heat. And standing in the middle of the street was the preacher himself, older now, wearing a long coat. But the preacher could see the fear in his eyes, the way his hands trembled as a shadowy figure approached him from the distance. The shadow grew closer, until it was right on top of him, and the preacher could see that it was not a man, it was something far darker. The shadow opened its mouth and let out a low, guttural growl, and the preacher could see the fear in his future self's eyes as the shadow reached out to claim him. Stop it!" the preacher cried out, stepping back from the mirror, his heart pounding. Ezra, who had been watching the whole time, said nothing for a moment. The preacher's reflection was still in the glass, but the image was now clear. His eyes were wide, filled with panic, and as he turned to leave, his reflection did not follow. Instead, the reflection stayed, staring into the dark, empty room, unblinking. "What have you seen?" Ezra asked finally, his voice low, almost mournful. The preacher, trembling, turned away from the mirror. He didn't want to know. He didn't want to see anymore. But the image of his future self, alone, frightened, and lost, clung to him. "There's nothing here," he said, his voice shaky. "Just a bad omen. A trick of the light." Ezra's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the preacher felt as though the old man was seeing straight through him. "No," Ezra said quietly. "What you've seen is no trick. You've seen what is yet to come. The mirrors here show the truth, preacher, but not always the truth you want to see. There are things in Red Oak Hollow that have been waiting for too long." The preacher stepped back, heart racing. "What do you mean?" "You'll understand soon enough," Ezra said, a grim sadness in his voice. "The mirrors of Red Oak Hollow show only what will come, and what will come is not always kind." The preacher left the house that day, the image of the dark shadow haunting him. But what he didn't know, what none of the townsfolk had warned him about, was that the future wasn't something that could be avoided. And in Red Oak Hollow, once you saw the future, it was already too late. The reckoning. The preacher, now consumed with the haunting vision he had seen in the mirror, couldn't shake the feeling that Red Oak Hollow was more than just a quaint town trapped in time. It was cursed. It was a place where the past and future collided, where the lives of those who entered could be set on an irreversible path by nothing more than a glimpse into a reflective surface. He could no longer deny that there was something sinister about the mirrors, something that made the very air of Red Oak Hollow feel heavy, suffocating.
As days passed, the preacher became obsessed with what he had seen. He found himself unable to focus on anything else, not the sermons he once delivered so passionately, not the simple prayers he had spent his life sharing. All he could think about was that shadowy figure, the one that had approached him in his reflection, the one that seemed to come closer every time he closed his eyes. And the more he thought about it, the more he understood the truth. This town, with its cursed mirrors, was holding on to something far darker than just an old relic. It was holding on to the future, and not just his. One evening, he sought out Ezra once again, driven by a need for answers. The old man's words echoed in his mind. "What you've seen is no trick. You've seen what is yet to come." The sun was beginning to set as the preacher walked through the town, the sky stained a deep orange, the air thick with the scent of impending rain. The streets of Red Oak Hollow, empty as they usually were after dark, seemed to stretch on forever, leading him to the edge of the woods where Ezra's house stood, hidden in the dark shadows of the trees. He knocked, his knuckles rapping against the wooden door with more force than he intended. The door creaked open, and there stood Ezra, his face as weathered and grim as ever, his eyes flicking over the preacher with the same knowing expression. "Come inside, preacher," Ezra said softly, stepping aside to let him in. "I knew you would come. There are things you still don't understand." The preacher entered, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. The air inside the house was musty, filled with the scent of old books and herbs. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Ezra motioned for him to sit, and the preacher hesitated for a moment, before finally taking a seat across from the old man. "I need to know what's happening here," the preacher said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I saw it in the mirror, Ezra. I saw my death, or what I thought was my death. And it wasn't just me. I've heard the stories from the townsfolk. They're all afraid. And they should be. Why does this town, why do these mirrors show what's to come?" Ezra's face softened, and he leaned back in his chair, the weight of years pressing down on him. "It's not just the mirrors, preacher," he began, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. "It's the land itself. Red Oak Hollow was built on cursed ground. The settlers who came here, they didn't know what they were stepping into. They thought they were starting a new life, but they were walking into something ancient, something old and hungry." The preacher listened, his breath catching in his throat. "There are things buried here in these hills," Ezra continued. "Things that were never meant to be disturbed. The mirrors, They weren't just made to show reflections. They were made to show what the land demands. The future, the past, they're not the same here. Not like anywhere else. What's reflected isn't just your image, it's your destiny. The land chooses, and the mirrors show what is chosen. The preacher's eyes widened. Destiny? But I saw my own death. And the others? There have been others, haven't there? People who've seen something in the mirrors, and then they disappear. Ezra finished, his voice low. Yes. They disappear because they're not meant to be part of the future. Those who see what's to come are marked, and when the time comes, the land claims them. The preacher felt a cold shiver run down his spine. And what happens if we try to stop it? If we try to change it? Ezra's eyes darkened, his face contorting with regret. You can't change what the land has decided. You can't outrun it. The more you resist, the stronger it gets. And those mirrors, they're the key. Once you see your fate, it becomes a part of you. The land will call for you, and there's no escaping it. The preacher stood, his pulse racing. I can't just sit back and wait to die. I have to do something. I can't let this town be cursed forever. Ezra's gaze softened, but there was a deep sadness in his eyes. You're a man of faith, preacher. You believe in salvation, in redemption. But Red Oak Hollow, it doesn't believe in such things. Not anymore. The land has claimed what it wants. And now it has you too? The preacher's hands trembled as the weight of Ezra's words sank in. There was no escaping this. No prayer that would save him. The mirrors had shown him his future. He was bound to this town, bound to the land that had cursed it. His death was inevitable, as it was for all those who saw the truth. He turned to leave, but before he could step out the door, Ezra spoke again. Preacher, if you truly want to understand, the old man said quietly, you'll have to look into the mirror again. But be warned, it won't show you what you hope to see. The preacher hesitated. The thought of returning to the mirror filled him with dread, but Ezra's words were like a call he couldn't ignore. He had to know. He had to understand the price that had been paid for Red Oak Hollow's curse. With a deep breath, the preacher stepped outside into the cold night, the wind howling through the trees. He made his way back to the house where the mirror had shown him his fate, knowing that when he looked again, it would be the last time he ever would. The price of knowing. The preacher's heart raced as he walked back through the winding streets of Red Oak Hollow, the chilling weight of Ezra's words hanging heavy on his mind. The town had changed since his arrival. Its air felt thicker, heavier, like it was pressing against him, suffocating him with its secrets. The buildings seemed to lean inward, as if they were watching him, waiting for him to make his final choice. He knew what he had to do. There was no turning back. Not now. He reached the house where the mirror hung, its dark, ancient frame a silent sentinel in the doorway. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle, but the door opened with an eerie creak before he could touch it, as though it had been waiting for him. The house was just as it had been when he left, except now the air was cold, far colder than it should have been. A thick fog had rolled in, seeping through the cracks in the wooden floorboards, curling up his legs like fingers. The fire in the hearth had gone cold, and the shadows that had once felt like quiet companions now seemed to shift in the corners, moving with purpose. The mirror stood in the center of the room, its dark glass gleaming, the reflection in it obscured by something he couldn't quite make out. The preacher took a hesitant step toward it, his heart pounding louder in his chest with every move. He had seen it once before. He had seen the dark shadow, the figure that had approached him with such malicious intent. But this time, it was different. He wasn't just going to glance at the mirror and walk away. He was going to face it, to confront whatever was waiting. Stepping closer, the preacher's breath caught in his throat. The figure was there, just as before. But this time, the reflection wasn't showing him the image of himself in the distant street. No, this time, it was showing something far worse. It was showing the preacher, but not the one standing before the mirror. No, it was the one lying in the field of red, the one surrounded by shadow, reaching out, his face twisted in terror. But the preacher wasn't alone in the reflection. No, there were others. Behind him, in the darkness, the faces of the townspeople, faces he recognized, stood watching, their eyes hollow, their mouths twisted in grimaces. They were staring at him, not with fear or pity, but with something far worse. They were waiting. Suddenly, the shadow in the reflection moved, and it was not the preacher's future self. It was coming closer, its form shifting and pulsating with an unnatural energy. The preacher's breath became shallow, his skin prickling with an awful sense of inevitability. "No," he whispered, backing away from the mirror, his legs shaking. "This isn't real. It's just a trick." But the shadow didn't fade. It grew larger, darker, and more solid, its edges sharp like the claws of a beast. The preacher could feel it, deep inside him, tugging at his very soul, pulling him closer to it, drawing him in. His heartbeat thundered in his chest, but no matter how hard he tried to step away, the reflection remained, watching him, waiting for him to fall. The preacher tried to turn away, but his body wouldn't obey. His legs refused to move, rooted to the spot as the darkness encroached upon him. The whispering voices from the townsfolk grew louder, echoing in his ears, their words like poison seeping into his mind. "You've seen it now. There's no escaping it. The land claims you." A cold sweat broke out on his forehead, and the preacher's breath hitched. He tried to cry out, to shout for help, but his voice was lost, swallowed by the growing blackness. His eyes flicked back to the mirror, and there it was again, the figure. The shadow moved closer, reaching for him, its hands like claws, its face now clear, twisted in an expression of pure hatred. "Please," the preacher whispered, his voice cracking. "No." But it was too late. The shadow reached out, and just before it made contact, the preacher's body went stiff, his breath frozen in his chest. He could feel the cold of the shadow seeping into him, filling him, swallowing him whole. His vision went black. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The preacher opened his eyes. He was no longer in the room with the mirror. No, he was standing in a vast, empty field, a field of red, just as he had seen in the mirror. The air was thick with the scent of blood and earth, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse, as though alive. He turned around, and there, in the distance, was the silhouette of the town, Red Oak Hollow. It was just as he remembered, but there was no sound. No movement. Just silence, broken only by the wind whispering through the trees. As he stared at the town, the preacher's heart sank. It was all wrong. Everything was wrong. The houses were empty, the streets deserted, and yet he could feel the presence of something else, something that watched him, something that waited. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, the figure again. The shadow, now fully formed, standing at the edge of the field, just outside the town. It was tall, its face hidden beneath a dark cloak, but its eyes, those eyes, they were glowing red, burning with an unnatural light. It took a step toward him. The preacher tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, unable to escape. The figure took another step, and the ground beneath the preacher's feet began to crack and break, the earth splitting open like a wound. "You've seen it now," the voice echoed once more, deep and resonant, filling the preacher's mind with an overwhelming sense of dread. "You are the one who has been chosen." The preacher's heart thundered in his chest, and he understood. This was not a curse that could be broken. No, this was the price for seeking the truth. The mirrors had shown him the future, and the future had claimed him. With one final step, the shadow reached out and touched him. A coldness like death washed over him, and he felt his soul being torn from his body, the land itself taking him, pulling him down into the depths of the earth. And just as his vision faded into darkness, the preacher's last thought was this. Red Oak Hollow was a town of mirrors, a town where the future was always watching, always waiting. And once you saw it, once you knew the truth, there was no turning back.